Hello, everyone. Short one today. Nonetheless, have a horn of mead. Today, our chapter is called Hunter. Hunter. And so, I will read to you chapter 36. Hunter. In the night, Hvitbjorn crept along the road in total silence. The sun had gone down, but there was still the vague impression of light shining from the horizon, and by this, he guided the horse along the path. After what felt like hours of riding, he found the tree laying across the road, felled from his left. He slowed his horse as he came to the place they'd emerged from the forest line and went left to return through the trees. The ride was slow. He didn't want to tax the horse overmuch after their mad flight, and he made certain to approach as silently as possible regardless. He'd left something behind, and he wanted to get it back. Along the ride, he found of all those he'd let down. He thought of all those. Saw the faces of all those he'd allowed to die. He tried to think how he could have avoided the disaster. All he could think was to have hidden the boats better. Those boats would be Harold's now, he was sure. The darkness of the trees around him was oppressive, but he pressed on carefully, letting the horse take as much caution in step as possible. Then in the darkness of the forest he saw a dim orange light ahead and dismounted. He breathed in deep and tied the horse off to a tree, and then creeped silently forward with a long knife held in his left hand, the tip pointing down. He approached without his white bear cloak. That he didn't need for this. The raider had struggled much with what he should do, if anything he should do. But he knew he could not go the whole night, without this task done. He'd left his father's cloak back with his friends because it was not the Hvitbjorn who came this night. He wore only the dark brown fur that he'd been found among the horse's saddle. The blade of the long dagger was held sheathed in black leather to guard against being seen by reflection, and thus he slowly approaching the light. Harold Sigurdsson, who must now be king, had camped his army right where the slaughter had taken place. The warriors were mostly asleep. Some were still up by fires and carousing with mead and roasting meat. Hvitbjorn looked among them for any signs of hypervigilant sentries, but saw none. He looked to the pile of bodies they'd stacked near the edge of the camp, and then looked away. He turned to the right and walked in a crouch to where he'd been sitting this morning, to where he'd left it. The firelight didn't reach far enough to illuminate anything for him, and so he but felt his way along in the dark. Eventually, he reached the small slope that led down to the iced over water and stepped out onto the surface, savoring the still silence as he heard no cracks. He slid his feet along the ice until reaching the center where the hole that broke through the ice was still easily discernible, even in the dark night. He came to the hole and knelt down, reaching into the water with his hand and waving it back and forth through the blue-black surface. It had, fortunately, not yet fully frozen over. The cold was there, just on the edge of sensation. Hvitbjorn put aside the dagger and started to remove his clothes. He took off the fur and the tunic under, then the shoes and the wraps and the breeches until he was full naked. He lay out the fur cloak to make sure that when he was done, he'd have a place to stand off the ice. He breathed in, tasting the cold in the air, and then dove into the water. The shock almost killed him. It was a physical force smacking into his awareness with the same impact of an arrow in his chest. His hands pushed before him as he plunged down to the perfect black of the pool. He had no idea how deep the water was, but still he plunged until his hands stopped at the bottom. There he felt something come against his opened palms, but he could not distinguish it. So total was the shock of the cold that he didn't know if he held anything, but he gripped down with both hands and as hard as he could and managed to reverse, getting his feet under him and kicked off the bottom of the pond that he hadn't even known would be there. He surged up despite the weight in his hands and came to the top, but his head hit the underside of the ice, and his momentum was halted instantly. He felt the pain on his crown, but it didn't matter. No, what mattered to him then was to cease the panic and keep calm. Either he was to the side of the hole or right in the center, where one last large chunk of ice still floated to stop him. He needed to find out that first. He let go with his right and started to feel above him. Instantly, the weight in his left hand sunk lower, and he had to struggle to keep hold of it. But he did. His hand then emerged from the frigid water to his right, and he turned to reach up for there. But he then realized that he was sinking again. He stayed calm, fighting the panic that threatened to resume, and let himself sink, his hand staying right where it had been at his side. He felt himself stop sinking and knew he must be at the bottom again, and so bent his legs and shot up with a heaving kick. This time he kept his hands above him, and soon he felt it leave the oppressive purity of the water. He grabbed the side of the ice and swung his leg up to create purchase from which to pull his head out. He took a huge gasping breath as he surfaced and felt his teeth chattering as he shook the water from his hair, then lifted his other leg out and stepped onto the floating ice block that remained in the middle of the hole. Using 3 points to stabilize, he twisted to a push-up position and hoisted the dead animal from the water. The wolf was stiff and limp all at the same time, but he managed to get it over the ice. He rolled over and he pulled the soaking carcass free from the water and then leaped to stand on his cloak. Shivering and cursing himself for a fool, he hurriedly brushed off the water and started to dress himself back into the clothing he'd brought. When at last the dark fur was around his shoulders, he sat heavily and shuddered. He was still wet, but the heat was working its way back around him. He breathed in deeply and steadied himself. It was done. He was alive. The effort of it all had warmed him some, and this warmth now wrestled with the cold, still clinging to him for dominance. It was terribly uncomfortable. He stood and dragged the wolf to the edge of the water, then hefted it and got it up onto his shoulder. The thing was huge and heavy, but he managed to hold it comfortably and carry it all the way back to where he'd left the horse. There he threw the wolf over the saddle and tied it on. Then he led the horse by the rein back through the dense trees into the road. He'd skin it in the morning, but for tonight he knew he needed to go and gather the massive creature. Hvitbjorn knew much of magic. Not all of it, but much. The mysterious woman Gertrude that he'd met all those years ago had awakened some kind of awareness in him, and he used it now. The appearance of the wolf, its slaughter at the hands of the man who'd opposed his command the most, then losing it in the water and having to save the man. These things were most certainly omens of great import. He couldn't continue to the next realm without having gone to collect a token from this omen. The bones would be burned into a sword at minimum. The fur would live as a cloak around him to keep company with the bear. The spirit of the wolf was now bound to him. Hvitbjorn knew that this wolf had died as a sacrifice. The gods, or the Veðir, or his own Hamingja had chosen the beast to die instead of him. It was by the grace of its ignominious death that he lived and escaped as he did. He needed to honor this sacrifice. He needed to make onto him the spirit of the wolf if he was to survive the world to come. He knew not what that world would look like. where he would go or what he and his friends would do, but this wolf's spirit would aid ever to guide their way. Of that he knew he was right. The gods ever had improved his luck. He saw now that luck was at the cost of much sacrifice around him. He thanked them for it. As he strode alongside his horse in the darkness of night, feeling the warmth climb back into his body, he decided to make another vow. He'd lost his army, lost friends. He had lost his axe, the axe of the bear, but he gained the wolf. Hvitbjorn decided then that he would use the bones of this massive beast that rode here dead to have forged an Ulfbert. Like Nathan's before, he would have a famous wolf with him. The time he spent as the bear had been stolen from him now. He needed to be the wolf. He had the skin, he'd have the teeth, and the bone, and the bright shining white iron of an Ulfbert made with the bones. The white bear was sure he'd get himself another axe to fight with, but it would be nothing like what he had fought and won with. His axe was gone. That was a loss he'd not be able to heal. Every bite of the wolf hence would be different, but it would still cut deep. That is the end of part 2. The next is part 3, entitled Viking. Part 3, Viking. Next time, we'll do chapter 37. Short and sweet today. Hunter. Apparently, the word wolf actually originates in the old word for hunter, ulf, U-L-F. Ulf, it means hunter. So Beowulf means bee hunter, which means bear. I think that's really interesting. I think that's really cool. Ulf, Ulfr, Ulfedner. It's fantastic stuff. And so, with and to that ends tonight's chapter. I will be getting that back to you soon with chapter 37 into part 3. Good night, all warriors.